Okay, we are live.
All right, good morning and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This morning, we are going to learn about Vermont conservation design with Bob Zano. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Sheldon, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak about this work. For the record, my name is Robert Zano, and I'm an ecologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Just some quick background, I've worked at the department since 2008. The majority of my work is the inventory, assessment, management, and conservation of natural communities. 97 different natural communities that range from hemlock forest to cattail marsh to dwarf shrub bog around the state. I go out, do field inventory, and work with landowners to ensure that those are protected, work with state land managers to ensure those are protected, and rarely, but occasionally work with them in the Act 250 regulatory process. That's one bin of my work, and that's very specific, focused on these small ecosystem natural communities. The other bin of my work is this large scale landscape ecology that we're going to talk about today. And that's Vermont conservation design. Vermont conservation design came out of the department's mission, which is the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. It's a very broad mission. It encompasses all of the plants and animals here in the state. How many is that? It's a lot. It's estimated that we have something like 20 to 40,000 different species. And as you can see on that pie chart, the species that are most familiar to us, the ones that we know the most about, birds, mammals, even plants vascular plants make up just a small slice of that pie. There are thousands of species that we don't know anything about. Most of them probably don't have names. They're not really known to science, but they are out there doing important things for our ecosystems and supporting the natural landscape that we know, and then the many plants and animals that we do know. How do we protect all of those? Well, fortunately, this is not a new problem for conservation science. There is decades of thought around this. And one of the leading approaches to this is this idea of using what are called coarse filters. So rather than going species by species, which is frankly impossible, we think about finding bigger features on the landscape that can conserve many species. Originally, the thought around this was to use natural communities that I spoke about just at the start. Find examples of those 97 natural communities, like the alluvial shrub swamp on the left there. Conserving examples of that protects species like alder, willow, maybe flycatchers that use those habitats, and then species like wood turtle that are shown there. You don't need to find every individual species in that place. If we protect that shrub swamp, we can have some confidence that the species come along with it. Same thing with the black spruce swamp on the other side there. If we protect that, we get many common species, as well as maybe rare species like spruce grouse and that moss called sphagnum moss, which grows only on moose and deer dung. The challenge with this approach is that we know that through millennia, and now even more so because of climate change, our current climate change, that species move. They don't stay put. And we have paleoecological data that shows the species we think of as being common and associated together now, here in Vermont, were not always this way. So these maps show, particularly the top one here that I'm going to focus on, two species, beech and hemlock, that we think of growing together in many of our forests, probably right up the hillside here. During the continental glaciation, 12,000 years ago, they were in totally separate places. They found different refugia in that environment. And then over time, they have shifted their ranges to grow together now. When we think about species going into the future, they're going to do that same thing. They are going to move, not pack up as units and march north in coherent natural communities. There are going to be 20 to 40,000 different individual species adapting individually and rearranging the whole landscape. So not only can we not deal with them now, we definitely cannot deal with them all in the future with that level of uncertainty about where everything is going to be and what it's going to need. We need an even larger approach. And that's where Vermont conservation design comes in. This is our vision. It's a science-based vision, is how we think of it, to sustain natural areas, forests, waters, wildlife, and plants into the future, protect what we have now, and ensure that we can sustain it into the future. Vermont conservation design identifies the most important lands and waters for maintaining ecological function. And I use that term very specifically because it is about maintaining the species that we have now, the fish, wildlife, plants, but it's about maintaining the functions too, so that as those species shift and adapt, we maintain the setting to support biodiversity, even with all these changes. That means we need a landscape that is intact, that starts with all the parts, that's connected so that species can move around, and that is diverse, that reflects not just something like the high mountains that we have here, but the whole range of landscapes and settings that we have here in Vermont, valleys to the tops of the hills. This design is a stacking up of those coarse filters. We went through a whole process of identifying what of those coarse filters at different scales were most effective for conserving many species, and we stacked them up to get to this idea of a landscape that would be intact, connected, and diverse, and sustain ecological function into the future. I want to go through these individual parts. At the broadest scale, at the landscape scale, our basic unit is called the forest block or the habitat block. And I think this is really intuitive. You walk into the woods, whether it's from a road or a field, and you're in the forest, you're walking through the forest, you might cross an open beaver wetland, that's part of a habitat block. You might walk through a place where the forest has blown down or been harvested and there's young forest, and that's part of the habitat block. And you keep walking until you hit something that is not natural cover, like a road, development, or an agricultural field. Agricultural fields can support some ecological functions, but they're not a natural habitat in the same way as the forest. So we've mapped all these habitat blocks in Vermont. There's about 4,000 of them that are greater than 20 acres in size. This work was originally done around 2000, around 2013, I believe. And this was what the habitat blocks looked like. In the last few years, along with Jens Hilke, who I believe you're going to hear from immediately after this, we've worked to update the mapping of those habitat blocks to go from this that you see here to this, which you can see. We've increased the resolution thousands of times to get at a much better sense of where our forest is and how those forests connect with each other. The data was so different that we couldn't even answer the fundamental question that we wanted to know, which was how much forest are we losing? When you go from this resolution to this resolution, the error between the data sources is really greater than the amount of forest change we've seen in the state. So overall, it looks like we are relatively okay with the amount of forest in Vermont. It has not changed dramatically, but we know that there are places where we are losing forest. We took those forest blocks, those 4,000 forest blocks, and prioritized them for different ecological functions, starting with, I think, one of the most obvious ones, which is where are the biggest and best forest blocks, the ones that have the best interior forest around the state. And on this map, you'll see that there's blocks of all different sizes, and that's because we used biophysical regions to, we selected the best blocks in each biophysical region. So the Champlain Valley has small remaining patches of poor forest, interior forest, but they're important. In the Green Mountains in the Northeast Kingdom, those best blocks are much bigger. When we have identified each of these features or elements of the design, we identified their functions. So they're providing that interior forest function in this case, and then the guidelines that maintain that function. So here they're very broad. It's about maintaining intact forest, limiting or preventing fragmentation into that intact forest. Impacts on the edge are much less severe than impacts in the center of those forests blocks. Forest management is totally consistent with maintaining forest blocks. It's that permanent loss of forest that is most ecologically harmful. Those interior forest blocks are the best in each region, but they don't form a continuous network. They don't provide the opportunities for species to move from one forest block to the other. And so the next piece we built in was this idea of connectivity blocks. How can we build a coherent network, stepping stones across the state that allows species to move? And Vermont is at this critical crossroads. We are the link between the Adirondacks and the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, where there are very large intact forests. So through Vermont, up through New Hampshire, Maine, and into Quebec. And we're also the pathway from the forests of the Berkshires up to the Sutton Mountains in Quebec. So we are the Grand Central Station of ecological connectivity in the Northeast. Everything is flowing through Vermont. And that's represented in this orange. The forest blocks connect to the Adirondacks through West Haven, and then up into the Northeast Kingdom and beyond, and north-south along the spine of the Green Mountains. This supports individual animals, so like the moose that wants to wander across the state, or bears that range widely to meet their life needs. It also supports the plants that need to disperse a seed, grow, and then disperse another seed and grow, and do that over generations and shift their ranges in response to changing climate. The third set of forest blocks gets at this idea of diversity. And how do we ensure that we're not just conserving one type of habitat when we look at our state? How do we get the full range of physical settings? Vermont is really rich geologically. We have all sorts of different rocks that underlie the state, and that physical setting, like bedrock and soils, hydrology, all of that has a direct relationship to biological diversity. The more physical diversity you have, the greater the biological diversity you'll have. So this was an effort to find the forest blocks that get us out of the mountains, out of the high elevations, and represent other settings like sand plains, clay plains, low calcareous, calcium-rich rocky hills, where we know things like sugar maple and many other plant species grow really well. So this is a third set of blocks that we are stacking into this. This is also key to climate resilience, because if we maintain that physical diversity, it's maintaining the stage for biological diversity. Or the metaphor that I always have to force a little bit is the idea of, it's like maintaining a network of stadiums for a sports league. And you know the players are going to shift around and be traded and come and go over time, but you need that network of stadiums if you're going to have the league. This is our network of stadiums right here. Not sure, it's not the best metaphor, but it kind of works. Here's just some examples of that diversity. The map there is showing different bedrock types, and the different colors represent different levels of nutrients available. So the blue are very nutrient rich, particularly with calcium. The browns are more acidic. And so you'll see very different species in different places. And there's some plants and animals that are tied to different physical settings. Moving on from forest blocks, Vermont Conservation Design identifies almost all waters and riparian areas as highest priority for ecological function. Water forms continuous networks. Ponds flow into rivers, or ponds flow into streams, streams flow into rivers. It's all connected. And the land alongside those rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds is critical to the functions of those aquatic systems. I think we know this all too well, the relationship between land and water. There's really no way to slice and dice that up at the large scale. when we actually do conservation work, we can narrow down where we might work in riparian areas. But at the big scale, we need functioning whole aquatic systems. Vermont Conservation Design also identifies within those riparian areas, where is there natural vegetation? That's places where you have natural forest usually, but also swamps, wetlands, shrubs, marshes along these rivers and streams, lakes and ponds. And those are really critical, not just for the aquatic functions, but for the movement of species on land. Many wildlife species use riparian areas as corridors to go between patches of forest, particularly in places like the Champlain Valley, where there can be a long distance between patches of large forest blocks.
Representative Austin?
Yep, just if I wanted the whole state map of that, how would I access it?
We have an interactive map online,
Okay, yeah,
and it's, I'm going to put the link, it's
Okay.
at the end, but it's called
Great.
BioFinder.
great, thank you so much.
Those pieces are the landscape scale. I think if we just conserved all of that, it's a good chunk of area. It would protect many, many species, and we could have a lot of confidence in our future protecting fish, wildlife, plants, and habitats. But if we step down in scale, we can look at some more specific pieces and how they add to that overall landscape network. And so you can see the list there on the screen. I'm not going to talk about each and every one of these, but I want to talk about a few to give you a flavor of them. Natural communities that I mentioned, I've done a lot of work on. Here's just 4 different natural community types in the state. And I think you can imagine each of these has a different set of species associated with it. Each of them has different processes affecting it. The wind and ice and cold on the top of Camel's Hump there is very different than the scouring and flooding that occurs along the West River in Jamaica, where that river cobble shore occurs. Even as we have change in the future, each of these places is likely to support very different sets of species. And so by having these different natural communities identified and conserved, we can have confidence that we'll have that range of biological diversity. Vermont Conservation Design sets targets to restore not just places, but conditions in the forest and on our landscape. 4 here: young and old forest structures and conditions, and then shrublands and grasslands. All of these are important for their own suites of wildlife species and for ecological processes. And here we're not mapping specific places because these can shift across the landscape over time, but we're setting acreage targets to try to reach in each biophysical region. Young and old forests, here's those targets in a little more detail. It's 3 to 5% of the forest as young forest and 9% of the forest as old forest. Because of our state's land use history, where most of our land was cleared, used for agriculture at one point, and now we have forests growing back, we lack both young and old forest on the landscape. It used to be that the forest was something like 60 to 70% old forest prior to the arrival of Europeans. And now we have less than 1% old forest. And that's an estimate because we don't even really, there's so little, we just know very little about the old forest here. But old forest is rich in structures that you get when you grow big old trees and they fall over and they die and they rot standing up and then they rot laying down and they build the soil. They have this whole structure and process that supports a diversity of species and often a greater abundance of common species because there are so many habitat niches in those old forests. We also lack young forest, which used to be created primarily through disturbance, natural disturbance like wind throw and ice storms. Now it's created mostly through forest management, but we have less young forest now, according to our best estimates, than we had prior to the arrival of Europeans. So species that depend on young forest, like ruffed grouse, chestnut-sided warbler, there's a lack of habitat for those as well. And the idea is diversify the forest at the edges and still have that broad middle range of forest.
I'm really hoping we can get through the presentation and we can ask questions at the end. So
What am I doing for
please
time?
write your questions on. You are great on time. We'll have plenty of time.
Grasslands are another element of Vermont conservation design, and they support a suite of bird species. It's grasslands that have very specific management regimes for species like bobolink, meadowlark, species that nest in the fields and need a certain amount of time to raise their young and get them off the nests without any sort of disturbance. These are species that would have historically been prairie species and probably very limited in Vermont. But because so much of the natural prairie has been lost, these birds are now using our agricultural fields and they've become a part of our biodiversity. And so identifying this target for grasslands that would be managed in a way that supports grassland birds is a way to keep these species that are part of our state now and that are a key part of what Vermont is now. I think anyone who is around fields and knows bobolinks knows how neat it is to see those in the spring. So again, this is not specifically where, but the idea that we want to find places to maintain that habitat and manage it very specifically. Unlike forest blocks where the guidelines are very broad, to maintain grasslands for bobolinks and other birds, the management is very specific. The mowing regime is very specific. And so conservation here is much more focused and targeted. But the area is also much smaller. So I've gone through landscapes and then layering in these finer scale features, and the other ones, aquatic habitats, so sections of that network of waters that particularly are important for supporting biological diversity. Wetlands, all wetlands are really critical for ecological function, and caves and mines, which support bats, but also many other species that I think we know very little about. I think the only other species I know that lives in caves is called the Taconic cave amphipod, and the name is the only thing I know about it. But we probably have incredible biological diversity underground, and that's something that also needs conservation. So if we put all those parts together, we have the core of Vermont conservation design. That's going to conserve many, many species that we have now and allow things to adapt and change into the future. And we can think about what that means for individual plants and animals. Some, I think we can almost check a box that, yeah, you know, if we can implement Vermont conservation design, maintain an ecologically functional landscape, that species, check, we are good. And an example of that here is this northern pale painted cup. It's a relative of the scarlet paintbrush that's found out west. Ours is not quite as showy. This plant grows in one place in Vermont, and it's on the cliffs and rocky slopes of Smuggler's Notch. Incredibly steep, rugged terrain. There you can see a picture of me conducting ecological inventory in that setting. This species, it's very rare in Vermont. Like I said, just one place, but I think if we can protect the habitat and protect an intact landscape, this thing is going to persist. At least that's about as much as we can do other than going in to look at it every now and then and maybe collecting seeds to ensure that if it does get lost, we have that biological resource. We don't need to go in and do any hands-on work, really. The contrast here is the spiny softshell, the turtle that nests on these small beaches on Lake Champlain. And there's an example of one of the sites right there. They're often small, close to people. They're subject to trampling by people who just don't realize what's there. There's incredible predation risk because you put a bunch of turtle nests in a small area and other critters figure that out very quickly. Hence the fences and other ways to keep people and animals out of there so the turtles can do their thing. If it wasn't for people like Tony Makula at the Fish and Wildlife Department and many others, this is volunteer training in how to find these nests. If it wasn't for that very intense hands-on work, that species probably wouldn't persist here in Vermont. It's an example of a species that is not captured by the work in Vermont conservation design. Making that distinction can help us focus on which of those 20 to 40,000 species need that one-by-one attention, and which can we feel pretty confident that if we're working at the landscape scale, at the natural community scale, we've got that, and that work is meeting that charge. We've done a little bit of accounting of this, and I think for common species, there's no common species that needs that intense hands-on work. Rare species, it seems like it's maybe something like 50% are likely to have their needs met by this broader conservation work, and the other half need some more focused attention. So that just in itself gives us a lens to think about how to prioritize and triage species. Maybe I'll say there are some common species like black ash threatened by emerald ash borer that are rapidly becoming or will rapidly become uncommon or rare, and those might need some hands-on attention, but the larger point still stands. We put this all together into the ecologically functional landscape that's intact, connected, diverse. It's a lot of Vermont. And that's because Vermont has a lot of nature. We're really fortunate right now. This is a design that maintains what we are fortunate to have in our state. It provides a roadmap for how to maintain the special things that we have here, our forests, our wildlife. So it maintains that intact landscape, it conserves species, and it's our plan to allow nature to adapt to climate change. I want to just dig into that point that it's a lot of Vermont and start with, here's a map of all the forest cover in Vermont right now. Everything that's green is forest or water. Lake Champlain's in there and it's not forest, obviously. If we were just to change our state and just go to the level of, or just maintain nature in the places identified as highest priority in Vermont conservation design, our state would go from this to this. And I think you can see there's a lot of forest, natural land, places that are valuable for wildlife and valuable for people that would be lost. So oftentimes people say, well, you've identified a lot of Vermont. How can this be a prioritization? And I'd say that it is a prioritization. We have a lot of nature, and just doing Vermont conservation design does not maintain what we have now. It is a way to allow for change and still, we hope, maintain ecological function in the landscape. So when we did this project, and I was one of the original co-authors, creators of this, we were huddled in a room that was about half the size of this. We were in complete science mode. We were not thinking about the broader implications. We were focused on how do we conserve species. But when we finished this, it's clear this maintains much more than species and biodiversity and ecological function, or rather that by maintaining ecological function, we sustain so many other things that are important to Vermont. And this has many other benefits to maintain this landscape. Here's some examples of how the department is using Vermont conservation design. It's helpful in our land acquisition process, what lands to prioritize for permanent protection. It helps us provide technical assistance to landowners, put an individual landowner's parcel into that larger ecological context. It's not a tool that is really designed to be a regulatory trigger, but it absolutely informs some of our regulatory processes when there's an existing trigger that would relate to the pieces of Vermont conservation design. And we use it in assisting town planning, and that's what I believe you're going to hear from Mr. Hilka after me. It's also key to our wildlife action plan, which is our overall guiding document. We're in the process of revising that wildlife action plan right now, and Vermont conservation design and this idea of conservation at multiple scales is going to be central to that update. We're not the only ones using Vermont conservation design. This is now being used in many similar ways by conservation organizations around the state. It's a model. It's really unique in the region. There are other states that have conservation plans, but nothing as comprehensive as this, in my totally unbiased opinion. No other state has thought about putting these pieces together in a way that really gets at all of these functions, particularly the intact, connected, and diverse piece. Vermont conservation design was also used in several pieces of legislation over the past couple of years that came out of this committee, including Act 59 of 2023, the 30 by 30 goals and 50 by 50 goals. And so one of the projects I've been working on to support that Act 59 effort has been taking the conserved lands inventory that was completed by the Vermont Housing Conservation Board and overlaying it with Vermont conservation design to look at, well, how are we doing on achieving Vermont conservation design with the tool of permanent land conservation, which is just one tool for getting at this design. It's certainly not going to be the only tool when we look at what it's going to take to conserve ecological function. But I thought I would give you just a brief glimpse into that work. It's still ongoing, but this is just a little piece of it. If we look at our lands that are permanently protected across the state into the three categories of Act 59, the vast majority of them overlap highest priority forest blocks in Vermont conservation design. Our past conservation has been well placed and it's supporting that ecologically functional landscape, which was awesome to see. There's very little land that is not supporting that highest priority area of the design. We can look across the different regions of the state, and you may not be familiar with all those names, but I hope the names are enough to sort of place it. The Vermont Valley is between Rutland and Bennington, the narrow strip. The Champlain Hills are between like Swanton over towards the mountains. And the southern and northern Piedmonts are the northern Piedmont is sort of like Memphremagog to Orange County, and then the southern Piedmont is Orange County down towards Brattleboro. We've made a lot of conservation investment in the mountains and the Northeast Highlands, the Northeast Kingdom. We've done less in other regions of the state. And this is showing a portion of Vermont conservation design around here in Montpelier with those highest priority forest blocks and where there is permanent land conservation. And you can see here, there's a lot of conserved land in places like Mount Mansfield, Camel's Hump, the Worcester Range, and we start to get that pattern of a connected landscape. But there's other parts of the state here, like around Brattleboro, where there's very little land conservation. And it's going to take either additional land conservation effort or, and probably, a whole range of other conservation tools to ensure that ecological function is maintained in those places. One thing that's clear, we're not going to achieve Vermont conservation design by conserving land alone. It's going to take all of the tools in the conservation toolbox to achieve this vision, including private lands stewardship, just willing landowners making choices about their land and wanting to maintain ecological function. One more chart. I mentioned the old forest targets, and old forests are often associated with ecological reserves. There's not quite a one-to-one correlation there because you can create old forest without an ecological reserve, and you can have an ecological reserve that's not old forest. That's what most of ours are now because we really don't have much old forest. But we can look at the ecological reserves we do have where management is not likely to happen, where natural processes will happen, and how that relates to these targets for old forest in Vermont conservation design and the forest as a whole in the region. And here we can see that there are a lot of places in the Green Mountains where we are likely to have old forest in the future because of these reserves, and less so in other regions of the state. So bringing this all together here, this is a vision, a scientific vision for what what we could do in the state to maintain fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats by maintaining the state's overall ecologically functional landscape. It's a vision that needs all the parts. It's we joke it's not a buffet where you can pick a little bit of this that you like and not take that you don't like. We need all the parts of Vermont conservation design if we are going to have ecological function over the long term. We know, of course, that different organizations, different agencies, different groups work on different parts. What the Fish and Wildlife Department works on might be different than what the Ruffed Grouse Society works on, which might be different than what the Department of Environmental Conservation works on, which is different than what the Northeast Wilderness Trust works on, but it's all feeding into this larger vision. It's going to require all the tools. I'm just going to stress again, this is not a map of land where we need to have government ownership or conservation ownership. It's a map of land where we need to maintain ecological function. And there are so many tools that can do that. Permanent land protection is an obvious one, but there are tools like use value appraisal program, like local planning, and voluntary stewardship that can also contribute to maintaining this vision. And lastly, I think this vision really shows that there is room for nature and people to thrive in Vermont. We've identified what we think is enough space to allow nature and ecological functions to persist. And by identifying that, it also helps us understand what places are not as ecologically critical and where we have other values, where those values might fit into our landscape and how we can put this all together in a way that is complementary. So for the very end, I just want to say that there are many, many organizations that have assisted the department in developing this work and being part of this over time. We first created this in 2015, and so we are 10 years in with multiple rounds of work on it and improvement and tweaking. And there's been many organizations that have assisted us with that. And there's the BioFinder website link where you can go and you can dig into any piece of this with an interactive map. And with that, happy to answer questions.
Thank you. That was great and helpful. And I always learn something new. And I appreciate you adding in the evolution of your updated work and how it fits into Act 59. Very helpful. And an important piece of why we were behind that legislation. I was a little negligent in not recognizing the other members of the Fish and Wildlife Department who are here. And before we get into questions, I'd like to give them both a chance to introduce themselves, including the new interim commissioner.
Good morning. My name is Andrea Shortsleeve. I'm the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife, and I've been a biologist with the department for 8 years and just really appreciate the opportunity to have Bob and Jens come and talk about work that we're extremely proud of and have made us really a regional leader in conservation planning and wildlife connectivity. So thank you.
Good morning, everybody. John Austin. I'm the Director of Wildlife with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Nice to see you all this morning. I've been a wildlife biologist with the department for 30 years, in this position for the last couple of years. I work a lot with Bob and very proud of his work. And as the Commissioner mentioned, Vermont is also very proud to have become a national leader on this landscape conservation work. And in fact, there was the New England Governors Eastern Canadian Premiers meeting this past September, where the governors and premiers signed a new resolution expressing support for region-wide collaboration to understand and maintain the connected landscape. So Vermont conservation design will be an important part of guiding those efforts.
Members with questions, I want to make sure. Representative Pritchard.
So I guess first of all, I'd like to say how appreciative I am of what the great work the Fish and Wildlife Department does. Big supporter of all the things that you do. My question is, habitat is an obvious concern. How does regeneration play into these blocks? And the reason I bring that up the Green Mountain National Forest, I'm a woodcock grouse hunter. And there's been a huge change over the last 15 years. The alders have grown up, the acid's gone in the soil, the woodcock have moved on. Orchards have changed. And really it's made a lot of those covers devoid, not just grouse and woodcock, but wildlife in general. And you always see when you can find those regenerative, the new alder growth and stuff like that. So I think part of this whole picture too is you have the old growth, you have new growth, but what is there a plan for the habitat regeneration?
A plan, well, yeah, that's a great question. And the young forest targets get at that idea of creating that regenerating habitat that is particularly rich in a certain suite of species. We also have the shrublands target, which I didn't really go into, and that's similar, except that might be more like the alders or some of those orchards that you were mentioning. So we have the target. We know that we are lacking in that structure across the landscape. And one of the challenges with that is that we don't have an easy way to map and identify where that is now. We can know where there's been some work done on like the national forest, on state lands, and maybe on some private lands. But I think the starting point that we really need to do is figure out where that is now in great detail, and then be able to say, okay, based on that, where can we enhance or expand those young forest and shrubland places? And that need for inventory is key. Doesn't mean we can't work on it in places like on wildlife management areas now, for sure. But I think at the statewide scale, really getting into it is this need for inventory and understanding what we have and what we don't have.
Representative Tagliavia.
A couple of questions. How does the conservation design and the idea of maintaining connected forest blocks and stuff like that, how is that going to reflect or interfere with people who have forest blocks, individual property rights? And to Representative Pritchard's question about habitat, I know that in my woodlot where we have done harvesting of some trees and opened up, we get regeneration and we manage to keep some of the wildlife there. But I'm very concerned about how this is going to affect individual property rights with regard to, okay, I get a notice, my land is in an area that's targeted for preservation. Have you just sent me a letter saying that I've lost my rights?
No, absolutely not. I really want to stress that this work is, from our perspective, a vision and scientific information. And it's the baseline, understanding how things fit together. And from where we started, it was all about what's important, what do we need to protect in those places, and then what is the range of conservation tools from permanent land protection to voluntary stewardship that could support maintaining those functions. And some of this does, well, I should say, so all of that is based on willing landowners for the most part, right? Land conservation is based on willing landowners. UVA is based on willing landowners enrolling in the program, and the incentives and voluntary programs are all because landowners choose to do that. There are a few places where in the past 10 years, Vermont conservation design has intersected existing regulatory work or new regulatory work, and it's been really, really limited. The department really pushes that these are not lines that are meant to be triggers for particular regulations. They might inform how certain regulations could be applied, but they're not that they should not themselves be the line that is causing something to trigger a regulation. And maybe since I have the commissioner here, I can pass that off if she has anything to add.
Sure, and I think in my previous life as a habitat biologist with the department, I spent quite a bit of time working with landowners who are interested in creating wildlife habitat in a variety of ways. And we use Vermont Conservation Design to help inform some of those actions. And so I think the department, and personally, I don't see this as a way to inhibit landowners. It's a way to inform and to also just I guess inform the actions that we take on land that landowners are willing to take. It helps enroll in the natural resources equip program, so where landowners can get money to do habitat work on their property. We've used the science here and the data here to help inform those decisions. So it really does not restrict, I don't feel it restricts landowners' ability to do what they would like on their property.
The reason I ask that is because if a landowner has a large enough tract where building a home or two homes would normally look and sound feasible, if I find, for instance, my block were to be in one of those heavily dark highlighted areas, is that going to be a no-go? How would a home smack dab in the middle of it negatively affect some of the habitat?
Yes, it would negatively affect the habitat from a wildlife point of view, but we are not coming here to use this as a regulatory tool to say you cannot develop there. When I've worked with landowners who have wanted to add buildings or develop parts of their property, we look at these maps and we say, your property encompasses all of these different parts of the different functions that Bob has highlighted. It would be better from a wildlife point of view to create this building closer to the edge of the forest block rather than creating, a half-mile driveway into the middle of the woods. So it's something that we are using to advise, but we have not used this to use as a stick.
I guess I would add, one of the reasons that I found an urgency in incorporating this was that we still have an abundance of these conservation opportunities. And I think it's fair to say, as Vermonters, all value the importance of the environment and biodiversity. So this is actually a chance for us to proactively make sure that we are conserving all of the pieces and parts that support that biodiversity at the time when we still have a lot of choice around those places. So there's opportunities across the landscape that willing and interested landowners can engage in a conservation process if they want to, and others don't have to, and we can still keep all of the parts that make it work intact.
One other question, if I may. It was a surprise to me to find out a couple of years ago that actually Vermont, way back in its history, or not too far back in its history, depending on how far you want to look, but it was 80% cleared and now it's 76% forested. So Mother Earth has a way of regenerating itself. The biodiversity that you talked about in your presentation, it like you said, with the beech and the hemlock, it had to move from somewhere. It was able to move in. Somehow or another, Mother Nature found its way into these areas where they were, and I could point out a number of places right near me where it was all hayfields and tillage, and it's no longer that way. It's beautiful sugar bush and stuff like that. So is that taken into consideration in the conservation design?
Yes, I think you make a great point about the resilience of nature, and I think we're incredibly fortunate that our landscape has regenerated the way that it has from that clearing. It's put us into a really good position now to have ecological function. We also know, though, that many of those places that came back from that clearing are not functioning as well as places that that were spared from that clearing. So in my time out in the woods, there's places where I go where I'm walking through the woods and I see depauperate understory of native plants and a whole slew of non-native species, the invasive species like honeysuckle, buckthorn, forming dense carpets. And then you reach a stone wall and you hit the slope that wasn't cleared because it was too steep and rocky to be good, or it wasn't tilled at least, might have been cleared. When you hit that wall and that slope, all those non-native species drop out and you have this stark line between those two. And suddenly you have all the native understory plants, you have a rich carpet of leaf litter, there's no earthworms in the soil. It's like a different world. And so we do see lingering impacts from that past land clearing for sure.
Representative Austin.
Yep. Thank you. I have two questions. One is, what is the region, the scope of the region that you're talking about? Is it Canada and Massachusetts?
So it's the New England Governors, Eastern Canadian Premiers have an association where they deal with policy issues on a regional scale. So it's all of the New England states and then Quebec and all of the Maritime provinces, including Newfoundland and Labrador.
Okay. The other question I have is about climate change. I know you're probably looking ahead, not only for Vermont's economy, but just in terms of species and, what is a projection for like 100 years or 50 years for Vermont in terms of climate change, and how are we preparing for that, or are we preparing for that? Especially I'm concerned, I'm wondering about the wildfires. If we had that kind of a drought here, would we be susceptible to that?
Right. I'm not an expert on all of the climate predictions, and I think I would dig myself into a hole if I tried to say much about that, other than I think we know that is constantly changing as we learn more, and it all seems to be happening faster and faster when we look at what we have now compared to past predictions. And it's more wildly unpredictable, I think, than we were expecting. Certainly we see that with flooding, with the extremes of cold and warm. And I think the thing that I'm most trying to plan for when I'm thinking about this work is uncertainty and options. We want to maintain as many possibilities for species, for nature, for whatever happens. If we reach a stage where our forests become very drought ridden and we have fires, we want to be resilient to that. We want to be able to have, obviously there's human resilience, but we also want nature to be resilient to that, so we can still benefit from everything that we get from forests and wildlife. And I think the way we do that is we maintain that variety of landscape. Hopefully not all of it will be experiencing the same sorts of conditions, different elevations, different regions, and build connectivity in so that when we have natural or other disturbances, then we can allow species to recolonize and reoccupy those spaces. My hope is that we just build resilience and then we're ready for what might come.
Do you have any prediction about the maple tree?
Well, maple trees grow as far south as Georgia, so I think I'd like to hope that we're okay.
Okay, thank you.
Live north.
I'd like to give this side of the table to opportunity to ask some questions. So, thank you, Robert, for the good work you're doing. I'm a numbers guy myself, so I really appreciate your evaluation and assessment and quantification of the things that you're seeing out there. So along those lines, what percentage are we toward achieving 30 by 30? You saw I saw lots of quantification bars, but in total, how far are we toward achieving 30 by 30?
Great question. I didn't want to scoop the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, but it's, I believe, 27%.
Okay, great. And thank you. So what percentage are we toward, you mentioned specifically Old Forest Conservation. What percentage are we toward Old Forest Conservation, and including in that things that we've identified that will eventually become old? Obviously, they're not there yet, but they will become old time. It takes time.
Right. So when we look at ecological reserves, which are places where there's minimal human impact. And we have some confidence that that forest is likely to head in the direction of old forest, because that's what happens when you leave forests alone in the absence of major stressors. We have about half of the old forest target met there. So if we were to actually get all of that into old forest. So I think it's 419,000 acres total is the target, and we're can't do the math on the fly. 209 maybe acres of ecological reserves. But the really important caveats are that that's definitely not old forest now. It's not equally distributed around all the state's regions and forest types. So we're going to have a lot of old forest at high elevations, not much old forest at lower elevations where we know there's more biological diversity. And we can get to old forest outside of those ecological reserves. We have some small areas of old forest for sure that are not in those reserves, and they'd be great candidates for protection if the setting was right. I'm not exactly sure what the quantification of that would be. So with a lot of nuance halfway there.
Sure, I understand, because there's lots of time involved and things can change over time. So,
Yep.
last question, promise. You've mentioned clearly that conservation is not the only tool in the toolbox, which is good to know. There are others, all the way out to voluntary stewardship and current use. Are those other classifications beyond just conservation, are they included in that 27%? Things like current use, voluntary stewardship, et cetera.
No, they're not. And they're not included in those charts that I showed. And I think,
If we included all those, how far would we be towards the
well, I believe we're, current use is high. I don't know the number,
2
but
million acres, I think.
which would be 50% of our forest. I'm pretty sure that if we were to think about current use, we'd be close to, if not over 50%, but I'm a little fuzzy on exactly where it would be.
Okay.
One last question, Representative Labor.
Thank you. Bob, you've conversant or familiar with the SFI program, Sustainable Forestry Initiative.
Well, a little bit.
I've instructed foresters that I've hired to manage my land based on the SFI principles, but also towards an uneven aged forest and let nature do the propagation. I've found some interesting things in my wetlands where beaver ponds were. They ate themselves out of house and home, packed up the family and left.
Mhm.
Consequently, the dam built and then ruptured 3 years later. 6 years later, they're back. I've had a beaver baffle system installed so the dam won't rupture, but I'm seeing changes in the wildlife. I used to have a lot of ducks come in, breed there, raise their young there. Once the rookery of blue herons came in, ducklings disappeared. So I think they're omnivores. But the other thing I've noticed with climate change is my open lands that I've leased to farmers for tillage. I'm seeing the bobolinks come back earlier. So if the state thought about changing the date of no cut on open fields, and the reason I say this is because the farmers I lease to have gone from 3 cuts per year to 2 to let the birds own the habitat for till July 1st. So are other areas of the state experiencing the same effects from climate change?
Yeah, great question. I don't have data on that. Maybe someone does. And I don't know about changing the date of mowing. The idea there being allowing the birds, you can cut before the birds nest, then give them the nesting period, and then cut the hay after, where you're not mowing over the nesting birds. And I think that's absolutely the sort of thing that we're going to have to be thinking about when when we see, I mean, we're seeing these changes, things are happening earlier and we're going to be adapting to them. So I don't know specifically that, but I think it's an excellent point.
Thank you.
Thank you again for your presentation and especially for your work on behalf of Vermonters. Members, we're gonna take a 5-minute break and allow our next witness to get connected to